All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club for inviting me to give this presentation. Very excited about it. So I'm going to be talking about the establishment and spread of an alien reef fish in Trinidad. And if any of you like aliens, maybe you can see my little artistic alien in the title slide here. So this is some work I've been doing with Dr. Ross Robertson, amongst other colleagues, but he's from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, but I'll get to that story in a minute. So the alien species I'm going to talk about this evening is called the Regal Demoiselle, and its scientific name is Neopomacentrus cyanomos. It's a very small reef fish. It only grows to about 10 centimeters in length. It's originated from the Indo-West Pacific. It's found all the way from Eastern Africa across to Australia and some of the islands beyond, as well as up to southern Japan. It's within the damselfish family. It feeds on plankton, which are very small critters found in the water column. In its native range, it's found on both inshore and offshore reefs from depths of about 1 to 30 meters. And it can be found in quite large aggregations. There's actually a recent paper that just came out by Harvey et al. In Thailand that found about 12,000 individuals across 8 platform sites. And the species alone accounted for 77% of the fish abundance. So they can be in high numbers and kind of the dominant fish on some natural reefs, and you'll see some introduced reefs as well. So as they mentioned earlier, my prior work on fishes was predominantly focused on larger species and most with commercial value, such as groupers, sharks, and snappers. So how did I end up working on this tiny little damselfish? So I'm going to tell you a story about it. So it all started on a small island off of northwest Trinidad called Gaspar Grande. We were diving in Priest Bay here. Here's Gaspar Grande, here's Priest Bay. Gaspar Grande is down here. And we were diving to collect fishes for our aquaria on campus. And while I was diving, I saw this really strange but quite beautiful black damselfish that I'd never seen before. And I had some equipment to try and catch them, but they're extremely evasive and very quick. So I was unsuccessful at catching one. But the image of it kind of was etched in my brain. When I tried to figure out what it was, it really didn't seem to fit any of the native species. So I kind of gave up on that because I wasn't getting anywhere, but the memory stuck with me. Several months later, Dr. Rachel Cullen from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama contacted me because she'd read my dissertation, which was on mapping, classification, and spatial variation of hard bottom habitats in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. And part of my dissertation was using this low-cost side-scan sonar equipment to map the seafloor. And so Rachel was interested in using this equipment in Bocas del Toro, Panama. So she invited me to the lab there, as well as to visit the lab in Panama City. So I could teach her technicians on how to use this system to map those areas. And while I was there, she introduced me to her colleague, who was Dr. Ross Robertson, who immediately started asking me if I'd seen this little black damselfish in Trinidad. And he described it and showed me pictures, and I immediately knew it was the same fish I had seen in Priest Bay. However, I don't think Ross believed me, but it must have been convincing enough that he actually organized a trip to Trinidad for the next month to see for himself. And to our excitement, it was what he was looking for. And he had been studying this fish and its introduction into the Gulf of Mexico that began several years earlier. And he had this theory that they were brought to the Gulf of Mexico via the oil and gas industry. So the occurrence of them in Trinidad gave kind of further credence to this theory, but we'll get a little more into that in a minute. Okay. So to describe this fish a little more, so hopefully if you see it in the wild around here, you can recognize it. I've showed you several pictures already so far, but here's another one on the right here. And it's most similar to a native damselfish known as the brown chromis or Chromis multilineata. And that fish is pictured on both the left and the middle images. The two fishes have slightly different body shapes, slightly different head shapes, but the most predominant feature you can use to tell them apart is this black shoulder spot that is only on the Regal Demoiselle. Both have black spots just at the base of their pectoral fin, which is this fin here, but only the Regal Demoiselle has a next dark spots above it. And the spot can actually look more like iridescent blue in some cases rather than black. So if you look out for that and see it, it'll be helpful. They also have different tail shapes and tail coloring, with the brown chromis having kind of yellow tips at the tail and the Regal Demoiselle having a very broad white patch within the inner part of the margin of the tail. They also have slightly different margin on the dorsal fin, which is on the top. Brown chromis is yellow. The Regal Demoiselle is blue in color. But they look fairly similar. Oh, and also the patch, this white spot, both have it at the base of their dorsal fin, which is this top fin, but the Regal Demoiselle spot is much larger. Their behavior is slightly different. They're both planktivores, but the brown chromis actually comes way far off the reef to feed, whereas these Regal Demoiselles, like, they're really tied to the structure where they can hide. So you rarely see them like more than 2 meters away from any structure. Their habitats are fairly similar, but again, the Regal Demoiselles really like high structure that's near a lot of currents. Okay, let's see if my video will play here. So this is a male. So the males have slightly different coloration when they're spawning. So you see those kind of grayish white blotches on its head and in the front of its back. So that means this male is probably looking for a female. So she will come and lay eggs in his nest, which would be down in this hole. Right. So once she lays her eggs in there, then he would fertilize them and protect those eggs until they hatch into a planktonic form. Right, so that's a little about their characteristics, what they look like. So let's look at this potential invasion or this introduction and how it all began. So it started in the Gulf of Mexico off of Veracruz, Mexico, in an area that does have offshore oil and gas industry. So there's a few sites discovered there in 2013, 2014, found them at a few more sites to the north and west. By 2015, they had made it to the Yucatan Peninsula. 2016 was the first sighting in US waters off the coast of Louisiana, where there's also a lot of drilling rigs. 2017, further expansion both off the coast of Mexico as well as the US coast into waters off Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Texas. 2018, a few more spots, not much change in that year. 2019, kind of a huge explosion of them in Florida, Northwest Florida. And we're gonna have to zoom out because this is when we found them also in Trinidad. So if we zoom out, We were just up there, and now we find them all the way in Trinidad. So it's highly unlikely that they traveled via some currents or anything to make it here. It seems to be a separate introduction that may have happened before or after the rest of the Gulf of Mexico. And then 2020, a few more sites off Mexico, and again, plenty more off Florida. In 2021, there were some reports of them off Aruba, but I have a question mark there because these haven't actually been confirmed with any videos or photos. But there is some harboring of oil rigs and ships around Aruba, as well as nearby oil and gas drilling in Venezuela. So it could be that they passed over from there and they really are there, or they could have potentially come from Trinidad and ended up there. But I'll show that a little later. And also in 2021, and this actually just happened last month, I received reports of them in Tobago at both Flying Reef and Arnos Vale. So that kind of leads me to the studies we've done so far of them in Trinidad and Tobago. So the first one, we did targeted surveys in July of 2019 around the northwestern side of Trinidad. So this shows the different sites we visited, and the circle size corresponds to the number of Regal Demoiselles that we saw at each site. So for example, the most we saw was at Monos Island, which was close to 1,000 individuals, where the least was, I think off a wreck, what is it called? The Island Princess. The one that just sank in Williams Bay there. We only found 3. So basically everywhere we went and there was big high structures, we found these fishes there. So they'd already been well established. There were all the different size classes and eggs seen and spawning males at most of these sites as well. So we're not really sure when they arrived in Trinidad, but they were first recorded in 2019. So the shaded gray area is where we suspect that they exist because of the depths they prefer and distance from the shore. We've observed them to this point, but it's highly likely they go further along both the western and northern coastlines. We just haven't had any reports of them as yet in those areas. And it's also highly likely that they're in nearby Venezuela as well. So a little later, following that survey, we did a trip to Tobago, and this was in late January, early February of 2020. We surveyed 31 sites around Tobago, and at that time, we found no Regal Demoiselles. But as I mentioned, they were reported at these 2 sites just last month. So there were none there in 2020, and now we're finding them there in September of 2021. Right. But however, the reports of the ones at these 2 sites, number 16 is Arnos Vale, and number 4 is Flying Reef. Adults were seen, but there were no males seen in breeding colors. So they might not be at the points where they're actually reproducing at these sites as yet. Also, during these surveys in Trinidad in 2019, we collected 100 individuals, and we sent those off for some genetic analysis to see if the individuals here were related to the ones found off the coast of Mexico. And basically what we found is that these 2 populations are very similar. So the ones in Trinidad are in yellow, and the ones off, the individuals off Mexico are in the 2 blue colors. And then the gray color represents individuals from the native range. So what this kind of tells us is that there may have been just one introduction that led to the other. So they were introduced either to the Gulf of Mexico and then transported to Trinidad, or vice versa. Or it could mean that there was multiple introductions, but they all came from the same kind of source population in the Indo-West Pacific. There's a lot more study that needs to be done to kind of parse out these relationships. But looking at the populations in the Indo-West Pacific, they're most similar to those from Taiwan and Indonesia area, as well as Sri Lanka and Oman, with some similarities also to some samples from India. Okay, so the next question is, how did they get here? And we kind of looked through several theories, the first being the aquarium trade. So these are fishes that are sold, like you can see the one here that's being sold for $5.99. So they're relatively cheap. They're available through online sources and likely some fish stores. But the aquarium industry really isn't that huge in either Veracruz or in Trinidad. And these fishes, they don't get very big. They're not particularly aggressive towards other tank fishes. So there's really no reason why somebody that had one in an aquarium would want to just go dump it in the ocean, like some other fishes, like lionfish. So this theory just doesn't seem to hold much ground because of these reasons. We don't have aquarium trade going on here, and there's really no reason to release them. And if they were being released by people in the aquarium trade, we'd find them in a lot of other areas as well. Like Miami is a huge place for purchasing and distributing aquarium fishes. So this not really looking promising. Next theory was to look at ballast water. So this is a way a lot of marine organisms are thought to be transported from one area to next. So basically the ballast water, when cargo is offloaded, they would fill this hold with ballast water from that particular area. And then the empty cargo ship would travel to its next destination to pick up its cargo. And when it picks up the cargo, it would unload that ballast water at that new port destination. So whatever was taken in at this port could be released at this port. And then the ship would continue on its journey with typically empty ballast tanks or with not very much water in the ballast tanks. So for this theory, basically many types of ships use this ballast water, and these types of ships travel throughout the world. So if this was the mechanism, again, you would expect to find these Regal Demoiselles in a lot more locations, and especially at, large port facilities, like near to those heavily used areas, which is not what we're seeing. Also, the ballast tanks have very limited food supply because it's not open to the ocean. It's a closed, contained tank in most instances. So even if the larvae or the fish were in there, they might survive for a little while, but eventually they're going to run out of food. And the journey from the Indo-West Pacific all the way to here is quite long. So this isn't looking like very promising either. So the next idea was to look at what's called the sea chest. So this is a compartment on most vessels that has a grate along the side of the vessel to an area that holds seawater called the sea chest. And the seawater is then used by various machinery or might be used for flushing toilets or things like that. So there's kind of this constant access to seawater when it's necessary. So this provides a nice little cozy hideaway for an alien species to travel in. right? Because they have access um, to open water and food. They can come and go as they please, potentially, if they're small enough. So this looks kind of promising. There's plenty of access to food. But again, we would expect to find these regal demoiselles in a lot more places if this was their means of transport, because a lot of large vessels have these sea chests, right? And again, we're only seeing them in these areas that have oil and gas industry. So that led us to look a little more in depth at the oil industry itself and how they might be traveling with the different vessels or with the rigs themselves. So the first thing we looked at was rig transports. And basically we found that the rigs are built often in the, or off like places like Singapore or around the Indian Ocean. This is where a lot of these rigs get built. And then they're shipped to the various locations around the world. And they're brought there by two different means. Either they're towed, which is very slow and leads to the potential of picking up a lot of hitchhikers along the way. There's lots of protected areas under the water. As you can see, this one that's raised up, there's all kinds of like hidey holes and structures that fishes could potentially hide behind. And of course, they're still going to have access to food because they're in the open water. The other way they're transported that doesn't really allow for hitchhikers to come along is via these rig movers. So this is where a separate ship actually holds the rig or platform on top of the vessel. These travel much faster, and there's not really hidey holes associated with these rig mover vessels themselves. The towing aspect is also worse for the companies too. It burns more fuel, it takes a lot longer. This new platform or rig gets beat up along the way, and there's always the potential to lose the rig if you encounter really high seas. The other aspect of the oil and gas industry are kind of the supply vessels or the service vessels, the vessels that work in and around the rigs. So a lot of these vessels will have what's called a moon pool. So this moon pool is essentially a cutout part of the vessel where these workers can easily and safely access the water, either using their drill stems, ROVs, or divers doing various work underwater. These moon pools are open straight through the vessel. When they're in transport, they might cover the top of the moon pool, but the bottom typically remains open to the open ocean. So this is like prime real estate. If you want to get somewhere in the ocean, you can just like swim in this big pool and just hang out there and have access to food and kind of travel along the way. So this looks pretty promising. This or the towed rigs are how we really think this fish is transporting these long and far distances. Okay, so where might we see them next? We saw them first in the southern Gulf of Mexico, then into the northern Gulf of Mexico, and now in Trinidad and Tobago. All of these places heavy in the oil and gas industry. So this theory that Ross has come up with, called the offshore oil connectivity hypothesis, kind of explains why we're seeing them in these three locations alone and not other places. We also see in a lot of these areas, there's inactive drill ships, there's all the support vessels that might be parked in, like we see in the Gulf of Paria, and put in cold storage. We also do a lot of dry docking here for these vessels because there's proper facilities and cheap labor for repairing and performing maintenance on these vessels. So not only do we have the rigs and support vessels for the Trinidad resources, but also a lot of other boats and vessels from other areas are coming here either for storage or for maintenance and repair. Right, so, oops. Yeah, so we also know there's heavy oil and gas industry off of Brazil, as well as off of Western Africa. So the species might be in those areas as well because of this oil connectivity hypothesis. And where to next? Since we found them now in Tobago, it's highly likely that they're gonna make it up the Caribbean island chain. And just to show how they might do that, here's a few examples of the currents on different months leaving Trinidad. So we have here where the currents could take these species to the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. From Tobago, it could take them up to St. Vincent and St. Lucia, maybe even to Barbados. And then another day, we see the currents change, and the trek could actually bring the larvae when they're planktonic up to Puerto Rico, or even all the way to the Dominican Republic in this instance. So there's a lot of different paths for them to reach these different islands, and it might not be just jumping from one island to the next. It could be big jumps in some cases if they follow these currents, because they can remain planktonic for over a month. And they also could potentially be transported via hurricanes. So that's another mechanism. So a little more about their biology and how they might be invasive. If we look at their feeding, I mentioned earlier, they're planktivores. They're likely generalist feeders, which means they'll probably eat most types of zooplankton because they're able to survive across this huge geographic area. They're typically found in areas where there's high currents. So in those areas, there's usually high abundance of plankton, which is good, leads to probably not competing with others if there's plenty of plankton to go around. But if the prey does happen to be limited, or if we find that these Regal Demoiselles have a preference for certain types of plankton, then they could be in competition with our native species that also eat plankton. I have an undergraduate student right now who's looking at their stomach contents to try and start to answer this question and see exactly what they're feeding on here. And the species they may be in competition with, this is a few of the planktivores we have in our local waters, several species of damselfishes, several species of wrasses, bait fishes, some juveniles, the jacks and grunts, your seahorses and pipefishes, as well as larger organisms like manta rays and whale sharks. So all of these species feed on plankton, so it's likely there could be some competitive interactions between them and the Regal Demoiselle. Especially if we start to see them in really high abundances, like they found on an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. They found 50,000 to 100,000 on one oil platform at a density of 50 to 100 per meter squared. So those kind of densities, I don't see how they couldn't have an impact on the local ecology, but there's still studies that are needed to confirm that. As far as their predators, like most invasive species, once they get somewhere, not much recognizes them as prey. Also, as I mentioned, they're very quick, they're highly maneuverable, and they dart into these holes or crevices when they're threatened. So they're quite difficult for predators to catch. However, they do come from the same native areas as lionfish. So the lionfish know them as prey and may have developed techniques to catch them. And there's a PhD student at the University of South Florida who's currently looking into the stomach contents of lionfish from Northwest Florida, where they have high numbers of both species, of both lionfish and the Regal Demoiselles, to see if she might find those Regal Demoiselles in their stomachs. So to be determined on that. I also want to note that at one of our sites in Shakashikari, that we've been monitoring this aggregation, a lionfish showed up, and the aggregation when it was there was smaller than the time before. And on our next visit, they all were gone, all damselfish and all the lionfish. I don't know what happened, but maybe the lionfish ate them all and then left. Let's see. The other thing to look into when you're trying to determine if a species is invasive or not are what habitats it uses and how it uses its habitats. We see that the Regal Demoiselle seems to prefer habitats that has some kind of hidey holes for them. They also prefer high relief habitats, things like coral reefs, rocky areas, hard bottom, caves, wrecks, rigs, really almost any artificial structure. Found them in small glass bottles, along jetties and pilings. Anywhere there's any place for them to hide and there's a decent amount of current to bring food, they seem to be there. So you can see in the pictures of them off 5 Islands and also on the Mammoth Tide Wreck. They're very unphotogenic fish. So, because they move so fast, but these black blobs in here are the Regal Demoiselles. And as you know, the water off Trinidad isn't super clear. Yeah, so these areas where they're found are also important habitats and have these hiding places and shelter that are important for our native fishes and other invertebrates as well. So we don't really know at the moment if these Regal Demoiselles are super aggressive like you see in other damselfishes. If they are, they may actually be removing and chasing native species from these holes and crevices. So that leaves these native species more vulnerable to predation. And that could actually have quite dramatic effects if there's, thousands and thousands of in an area that basically leaves no place for the native species to shelter. Okay, and the last thing that's really important is in determining kind of invasiveness is how well a species can reproduce. And these are really good reproducers. The female can lay between 1,500 and 2,200 eggs per clutch. As I mentioned, she lays her eggs on a hard substrate, and then they're fertilized by the males and protected by him until they hatch 3 to 5 days later, where they become planktonic for about 28 to 35 days. And when they're in this planktonic stage, they need really high nutrient water because they're tiny. They're about 2 millimeters when they hatch. So it's likely all they can eat is phytoplankton, which only blooms in when there's sufficient nutrients for them. And they first mature at about 340 days post-hatching, when they're a size of about 65 to 70 millimeters in length. And they've been found to reach ages up to 7. And they continuously spawn once they're mature, about 5 to 6 times per month or every 4 days. The males can also care for more than one female's eggs at a time. So this equates to about 13,200 eggs per female per month. And this is much lower than the lionfish, which produces about 200,000 eggs per month. But both have similar ages at maturity, which is less than 1 year old. The lionfish have a shorter planktonic stage, it's around 17, 18 days. But it's thought that these Regal Demoiselles may actually have higher survivability, even though they're producing less eggs, because those vulnerable egg stage is actually guarded by the males until they hatch. So this is just to show some images. This is from Rohini Krishna et al. Of their life history. So this is a male guarding his huge clutch of tiny eggs. These are the freshly hatched or freshly laid eggs. This is about 1 day old, 2 day old, 3 day old, just hatched larvae, and 5 day old larva, 10 day old larva, 30 day old larva, just about to settle, 60 day old juvenile, 75 day old juvenile, 120 day old fish, and 300 day old fish, which are not yet mature. So then about 40 days later, they would mature. So another interesting thing about this fish is that it's thought to change sex. So they would start off being female, and then change to males once they reach a certain size. This is called protogyny, or being protogynous, female first. So the females would mature first around what I said before, about 65 millimeters in total length. And then all the males they found in this study were over 80 millimeters in length. So it's likely around that size is when they start to switch. As you saw before, the males have those nuptial colors once they're ready to spawn. And this study found a 4.6 to 1 female to male ratio. So a lot more females than males, which is actually quite common when you have sex changing species. The sex that matures first will be in much more abundance than the sex that the fish turn into. So if growth for some reason or another in the species is inhibited, it could hinder their reproductive success. And we see this in a lot of commercial species of sex-changing fishes. So some other protogynous species, like a lot of the groupers, they get fished when they're too small. So a lot of the population never makes it to be a male. So you end up with, 25 to 1 female to male ratio. And that obviously doesn't lead to high success when you go to reproduce. This images are just showing the nuptial colors again. And then finally, how is the species going to deal with climate change, right? We see a lot of invasive species that are probably going to do even better as the climate continues to change because of kind of some of the characteristics I've gone over up to this point. So are they tolerant of a wide range of environmental conditions? And basically, yeah, that's what we're finding. I mean, we find them in estuaries with low salinity, high nutrients, and high pollution in Trinidad. Off Mexico, they're in really clear waters, on reefs and wrecks and rigs. Off the Mississippi River, they're in super murky waters coming from that river, either hard bottom or artificial reefs. And up in the northern Gulf of Mexico they're also influenced by a wide range of temperatures. It gets very, very hot in the summer and quite cold in the winter, and they seem to be able to tolerate that to some degree. I also have my PhD student, Justin Sui, is looking into the effects of salinity and temperature ranges on their reproductive output. So to see if they can still reproduce at these really high rates at higher or lower temperatures or higher or lower salinities. And that'll give us some indication of their fecundity as their amount of eggs they produce as these conditions change with the climate, with global warming. So yeah, they seem tolerant to many conditions. They live in a wide variety of habitats. They're found at greater depths in the Gulf of Mexico than in their home range. They've been found down to depths of 53 meters, whereas their home range only to 30 meters. And some other things we're doing to look into this is we have loggers set up off both Northwest Florida and here in Trinidad to monitor the temperature and salinity in conjunction with trying to monitor their abundances, their size distribution, to see if they're impacted by extreme heat, cold, or low salinities, although that's been hindered by COVID and not being able to get in the water. Hopefully we can start that back soon. And we also have some tags that we want to implant in them to see if they have strong site fidelity, if they just kind of stay on one little rocky area or one cave, or if they actually are moving around these habitats, either depending on the conditions or moving to find food, or those types of scenarios. So that's some ongoing research there. So just to conclude, the Regal Demoiselles seem to be here to stay. Their numbers are quite large and growing, and their distribution is expanding. It's expanding quite quickly, and they'll likely become established up the Caribbean islands and elsewhere soon. Our data on reproduction and environmental tolerances hopefully will help us develop some better models to predict their expansion in the area. And we need to do a lot of further evaluation to see if they are invasive, as in, are they actually impacting the local ecosystem? And it'd be great if we could put some measures in place to try to keep this and other alien species from traveling with oil and gas infrastructure and those support vessels, either by not allowing towing of oil platforms anymore, or of somehow putting up some kind of feature along the bottom of those moon pools to help keep introduced species from traveling in those moon pools. So with that, I'll take any questions. I just have a short little video here so you can see them moving around. This is by Priest Bay, where we first saw them. And feel free to contact me or Ross if you guys have any questions, or if you happen to see one somewhere. Would love to get those reports. Thanks. Got a slide with my references if anybody wants to see that. I'll go back to the question page.